Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final session this afternoon, which is essentially on successes and failures of climate change. Now, my name is Jonathan Shaw, and I'm with the Asian Institute of Technology, and I'm moderating this session. We also have with us on the panel, and in the order that they will be speaking, addressing this issue, we have, of course, Salim Al-Haq, who's the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University in Bangladesh, and also senior fellow with the International Institute for Environment and Development in London. We have Mazaharul Alam, the Regional Climate Change Coordinator at UNEP ROAP, and the link person between ROAP and DTIE, which is the lead UN division for climate change. And finally, we have Johan Kulenstierna. And I'm always going to mispronounce your name, even if you tell me 100 times how to pronounce it. But Johan, of course, is the executive director of the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is an international research organization focusing on environment and development, with 9 offices in 6 different countries. So we have a tremendous panel, and we have a fairly broad canvas on which to discuss and to examine issues this afternoon. What do we mean by success and failure? What are the criteria we are using to measure success and failures against? Is it simply a question of meeting project goals, and if we've met the project goals and we can write a nice report, then we say we're succeeding? Or are we actually looking at some higher definition of what success needs to be measured against? And I think at that point I just wanted to kind of circle back to one of the first things we heard today, and that's perhaps there is a need for transformative thinking on the issue, and that's Salim's words from a question in the initial keynote session. Are we perhaps being too cautious in terms of how we approach the question of adaptation and adaptation mainstreaming? The goalposts, are they moving, or are we satisfied that they remain the same, and that at some point we will know that we've actually achieved adaptation, and at that point we can move on to something else? Now, we're dealing with, as I said, a very broad canvas. We've heard sessions today, and unfortunately, because of the structure of the conference, not one of us has been able to attend all of the sessions. But we've heard about the importance of cross-sectoral policies and plans. We've talked a lot about mainstreaming adaptation, which of course is the theme of the conference, and there was a very lively panel discussion this morning. We've heard about insurance and risk management, and we've heard about the relationship between climate finance and governance. We've talked about investments in adaptation technologies with mitigation co-benefits, which also raises the question, as CDKN do constantly, of whether we should really be talking about mitigation and adaptation separately. It's quite interesting because I do participate in both communities, and for the most part, the communities are mutually exclusive. For me, that's a rather strange phenomenon. Of course, the people I do meet at both are the CDKN people. We've had sessions on building capacities for local adaptation planning. We've talked a lot about access to climate change adaptation and climate CCA finance for short. And we've talked about strengthening the capacities for access to management of climate change adaptation knowledge, and that was the session that Johan has just come from managing. So I think, without further ado, there's many things that people will want to talk about, and we've left it up to each of the panelists in this session to address the issue in the way that they think fit. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Salim now, and Salim, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to try and do 3 things in the time allotted to me. The first one is a little broader overview of where I see the words success and failure in the context of the climate change problem or issue. And then more specifically in the context of adaptation, and focusing perhaps a little bit more on the notion of failure and the notion of learning from failure. And then I'll have some few concluding remarks. So the broader issue of failure and success on the climate change issue, in a sense, adaptation, or us having to adapt to the climate change problem, is the result of us globally failing to mitigate. Originally, when we started looking at the climate change problem, it was a matter of emissions of greenhouse gases, and the solution was to reduce those emissions, and everybody agreed to do that, but they didn't do it. Had they done it, then we wouldn't have had to adapt. Because they failed to mitigate, we are now having to adapt. And we are now even looking at the potential failure of adaptation, in which case we're going to have to deal with a new phenomenon called loss and damage after adaptation or beyond adaptation. And so, in a sense, the entire 2 decades worth of tackling the problem of climate change, talking about tackling it, and tackling it in little ways, is a journey of failure. And one failure has led to the next. Mitigation failure leads to adaptation. Adaptation failure leads to loss and damage. And unfortunately, that is the way it's going. It is a series of failures to do what is needed. Having said that, let me now focus on the issue of adaptation itself. And I recall speaking at the previous adaptation forum in Bangkok, where I said that as we learn about adaptation to climate change, I made the analogy of us making a journey of learning from early childhood, going to kindergarten, to primary school, to secondary school, to high school, to university, and so on. And on that sort of time scale, it's about 20 years from early childhood to finishing with one's full education. We are still at a very early stage. We're still at the sort of maybe kindergarten going into primary stage. So let's not assume we know too much. We still don't know enough. And therefore, we don't even know what success is. So let us not get too hung up on success. You know, one can couch success in very narrow terms in terms of a project, doing some activities and doing some outputs, which is fair enough. It, I think, is reasonable at that level. But have we built successful adaptation? We actually won't know for another 10, 15 years when climate change happens. So one of the questions I ask to any major donor or investor in climate change adaptation projects and activities, and there are many of them here in this meeting, is if your project is meant to support adaptation to climate change, and you only have 3 years or 5 years to do it in, you're not going to do adaptation to climate change in that time scale, because that time scale is not the time scale on which climate change is going to happen. On that time scale, we may have some climate variability, we may have some events that we need to look at, floods or droughts. That's not climate change. Climate change is going to happen over the next 10, 15 years. And what you are doing, therefore, in a shorter time scale is building the investment for being able to deal with climate change on that longer time scale. So, to me, the question that I ask all these donors and investors is not what do you intend to do with your money during your project, but what do you intend to leave behind after you have left? Because I'm going to be here after you've left. The people are going to be here after you've left. And climate change is going to happen after you've left. So you need to answer the question, who are you going to leave behind? What are you going to leave behind? And to me, that is the outcome of your project. Not what you do during it, how many trees you plant or wells you dig or Land Rovers you buy, doesn't matter to me. And the question then is, what is your exit strategy? You have to start that up front. So what is different about an adaptation program? An adaptation program starts by saying, what is its exit strategy? What is this project going to do when it leaves? Because during its lifetime, it's not going to be adaptation to climate change. It's going to be adaptation to some climate variability. And who is it going to leave behind? So you have to identify who you want to work with, whether they be a government agency or a non-government agency or an institution, whoever. that you need to engage with, build their capacities to adapt, and then you leave behind that capacity to adapt. And that capacity, you hope, because you're not going to be there 10 years from now when adaptation to climate change will be tested, you hope it will be adequate to deal with the impacts of climate change and will have built adaptive capacity. So you need to think about investments in two timescales. You're investing now in planting something that is going to pay dividends years from now when you are gone. And you have to think of this as a portfolio investment, okay? So it's investing in adaptation is like in a portfolio investor who's putting money into different entrepreneurs. And a portfolio investor doesn't look for every single one of those to give a return. They can invest in 10 different things, and one of them gives them a return 100 times. Other 9 can die, they can disappear, they can be zero, doesn't matter. The investor has returned 10 times what they invested from only 1 out of 10 investments. So we need to think in those terms. Failure is not bad, as long as one of them pays off. 1 out of 10 pays off. And so we need to start thinking about adaptation investments, failures as something that are acceptable, something we learn from, something that we don't shy away from. Because we don't know what we're doing, we're going to have to try many different things. Many of them will fail. Some that succeed, we then have to scale up massively and quickly. And that is going to be the challenge for us. And I think over the next few years, we just need to make lots of investment. Let 100 flowers bloom. Let us learn from all of them. And so the emphasis in the short term is on the learning. Whatever we do, we must invest enough to learn from what we have done. The learning is really what we can bring out very quickly, share that in real time with everybody else. And again, as I said, one success can lead to 10, 20, 100, thousands if we can then disseminate that knowledge to others in real time. Thank you.
Thank you, Salim. We're well ahead of schedule. I'm going to turn, well, first, I guess the format is if there are any clarifications, not substantive questions, but if anything that Salim has said that you wish to clarify before we move on. I take that as a no, so we go straight over to Babu. And Babu, please.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, colleagues, friends, and the adaptation practitioners attending this forum. Let me begin, before I touch upon one of the key elements of this session is the best ways to enable learning among the government organizations, communities, and the actors. But before I do that, let me see how to say the success or the failures, and then how it is a kind of a continuum. If we look the success, and maybe someone can define it as an achievement against the set goals, or failure or the limited success can be stated as that unable to achieve that set goals. And now these set goals are actually been happening at the different levels in the climate change discussions. If we looked into the negotiations where the broader goals are being set, and then we can see that as a success in the negotiation. Setting up the mitigation target at the global level is a great success due to the higher level of the awareness and what the science is contributing to it as a requirement. Now, if we translate that into the national level or the sectoral level, there are also success the country is able to meet that the goal that has been set at the global level. But if we look at collective action, which Salim has mentioned as a scale, is nowhere required to meet the global goals that has been set up. So then how to define that success? It depends on at what scale that we are looking for and against what goals that we set up and what are the achievements. So that is probably the one way of saying the success and the failure or the limited success. Now, as I mentioned that these goals are being set at the different levels, and that's why the learnings are also coming from the different levels. We have the different sets of the learning at the global level. We have different sets of the learning at the national level. We also have the sets of the learning at the local level, both in the aspect of the climate change mitigation, in the aspect of the climate change adaptation. Now, let me touch upon, if we looked into the learnings of the climate change adaptation from the global to the local level, starting from setting up the National Climate Change Adaptation framework, and before that, even for the LDCs who has agreed to prepare the national framework action for the adaptation, it is better known as NAPA, and that leads to the NAMA. So at the global level, if we looked into the policy and the planning, it is a very, very good success. Now, if we looked into that translating into the national level, the LDCs has prepared their NAPA, and the implementation is happening in many countries. So the learning can come from there. If we looked into the international level where the climate change adaptation finance mechanism has been set up, and there are the learnings how the finance is happening and how the finance is going to the countries and the sectors. And there are different means of the financing that is happening. If we also looked into the international level, the Nairobi Work Program, that managed to bring the different stakeholders together to support the countries on the climate change adaptation tools, the methodologies. So there are success. Now, if we looked into the implementation of those tools at the national level or the sectoral level, there are challenges. So I'm just saying that we have the success and there is a continuation of the success and the limited success and the limit of the implementation. So it is very difficult to separate out the success and the failure as the scale varied. Now, if we looked into the actors, it's not only the level, actors are also the different at the national level and the local level. And the actors' engagement are also varied. So the learning is also going to be varied when we are talking about at the national level actors, starting from the Ministry of Finance, Planning, and the sectoral ministries where they're implementing the project on the ground. So in order to then, the way of sharing the learnings, how best then to share the learnings as the success and the failures are interconnected and it's varied at the different levels. Now, with that, let me just touch upon the few key points that I thought important, and we meaning the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network, which has set up some mechanism to share the best learnings. The one is the sharing learnings among similar actors, and these actors can be varied at the different levels. But if we target the similar actors where the learnings are coming in the similar in natures and as their action are almost the similar. So that could be one way to share the learnings among the similar actors. And it could be the planning, it could be the finance, it could be the sectoral people, it could be the local communities. So that's the one way of targeting whom we need to share this, the success or the failure at the different level. The second one is learning from each other. When we are able to connect the similar category of the actors, and then they will able to learn from each other. As Selim said, that the failure is not the bad thing, but can we learn from that? And an only learning can help if we learn from the similar group of the actors because they speak in the same language and they handle the same thing in their day-to-day operation. Now, having said that, now what is the mechanisms that can actually enable them to share their learnings? At least the two things that I have in mind and the similar things that we have done. One is the sharing through the web setting, which is basically the electronic sets. It's called the Adaptation Knowledge Portal that the Asia Pacific Adaptation Network has set up with a number of collaborative partners. So this is another important issue that when we're talking about this, the mechanisms to share is not only setting up the mechanism electronically, but how many partners are entering into that web portal and willing to share their learnings. So the success depends on the learning depending on who are sharing their information through these mechanisms. The second thing is important also, that what are the common learnings coming from? Because when the actors are talking and sharing their learning, there must be something common. Is it possible to synthesize that common learnings and share among the same or the similar group of the actors? And this capture these learnings at the different levels, as I mentioned, the global, national, subnational, locals, by actors, the planners, the decision maker, the finance, etc. Now, the way we set up, and there is no one size or the approach that we can think is appropriate, but we tried to come up with a kind of an approach for the sharing this knowledge through the mechanisms called this Asia Pacific Adapt.net, which is the web portal for us to share the knowledge and the learnings. And learning through this, the web portal, we categorize the learnings under the themes.